Well, how do you make sense of the ending? One way is to put it in context. It's 18th century Gothic literary context. You know something about that because you've read Walpole's The Castle of Otranto. You haven't read Matthew Lewis's The Monk, which is a book that came after this book, an illustration of which may be found to your left. Does that look familiar? Shades of The Castle of Otranto? Superficially, yes, but by no means when we look more closely. You'll recall how Walpole's Alfonso, a father, kills his own daughter, Matilda, stabbing her from behind. But here in this illumination, we have a father of a different kind, a father with a big F, a priest, a monk. Are we then better reminded of the scene from the Italian? The Italian has plenty of murderous monks. Again, I would argue, by no means, not when we look closer. The closest the Italian comes to this episode occurs at the secluded beach mansion. You'll remember that scene when the monk Schedoni draws his poniard and raises it to strike. But you will recall, he does not strike. Rather, seeing the face portrayed in the miniature hanging in the locket worn by Elena, he is himself stricken with horror. He is rendered as a horrified or, by definition, quote, aghast and motionless like a statue. She, he at this point believes, is his own daughter, his own lost daughter, one who carries about with her his likeness in the miniature hanging from the locket. Radcliffe, like Walpole, then, makes the killer a father, small f. Unlike Walpole, like Lewis, he makes the killer a father, large F. Unlike both, but in a sense combining them, he makes the killer a father, right? And you can put the larger F on either side. Father, or father. Radcliffe retells both Walpole's and Lewis's stories then, combining them. In Radcliffe, the threatening male is both a father and a father, big F. But he also rejects both stories, in a sense, or at least the endings of both stories, because he gives both, at least in this one respect, the fate of paternally threatened daughters, a happier outcome. In fact, the poniard does not fall upon the exposed breast of Elena. In Lewis's The Monk, written in 1796, as I've noted, the monk of the title does not almost kill the heroine. He does kill the heroine. Many feel that this book, The Monk, and its extreme representation of passion, sexual desire, death, the supernatural, and so on, inspired Radcliffe to write The Italian. She wanted to save the Gothic from the hands of the radical Lewis, who had the ruler and the priest change positions. It is as if he made Walpole's good guy, good father monk, Jerome, the villain, thereby staging an affront to the church, to religion, one safely aimed, of course, by this Protestant Englishman at a particular church, the Italian Roman Catholic Church. Radcliffe didn't like this radicalism and felt that the Gothic, to the extent that it had been seen as the source of such radicalism, felt that it had been hijacked, in a sense, by Lewis, and Lewis and all of his extremism in The Monk in 1796. And therefore wrote The Italian as a means of, in a sense, pushing back and correcting the Gothic that had gotten off track. You may have noticed by, in a sense, going back to some of the radical potential available in the Castle of Otranto and going with it. Well, Radcliffean Gothic then, I mean, could we say that in a sense it's anti-Gothic when you see it backing away from Walpole and Lewis? That's a question that arises. And a real easy, quick answer is, well, maybe it's not anti-Gothic, which is to say maybe the Italian really is pretty daggone Gothic. For it does include any number of the typical Gothic themes, issues, and conventions of character, plot, setting, and so forth. And you remember some of these from our intro video several weeks ago, which was based upon, and I think quoted, Abrams, and Abrams, his handbook description of the Gothic or characterization of the Gothic. But in this moment, let's not go back to Abrams. Let's go to a list of Gothic conventions provided by Professor Milani at the City University of New York. And let's see how well they fit the book. What makes a work Gothic is a combination, writes Milani, of at least some of these elements. And I've given you, by the way, down below, website that you can go to where you can find this and a lot of other things about the Gothic. Well, a castle, ruined or intact, haunted or not. Absolutely. For example, Paluzzi, we've spent some time there and there's no reason to go back and revisit. What about ruined buildings, which are sinister, which arouse a pleasing melancholy? Well, for example, the ruined villa of Cambrusca, which we see in Book 3, Chapter 1. Cambrusca, of course, is, he's got a number of aliases, does Schedoni, but it's in fact his old ruined villa or a place where he lived. Let's not get into the complexities of exactly who owned it. Which is, you will recall, has all these, there's so many of the different spaces which had once been buildings and have now become ruins. Ruins is the best word for them. It is characterized, this one in particular, by shattered remains, right? In this case, the shattered remains of a tower rising beyond the arch. We have that kind of language at Paluzzi and at a number of other locations in the book, settings in the book as well. So check, absolutely, ruined buildings which are sinister, which arouse, on the other hand, conceivably a pleasing melancholy. I think most of the buildings in the Italian that are ruined, that are ruins, that are shattered remains, are sinister. Okay, what about dungeons, underground passages, crypts, and catacombs, which in modern houses become spooky basements or attics, or labyrinths, dark corridors, and winding stairs? Well, again, there are many examples, are there not, in the Italian? For example, the dungeons and whatnot of the convent of San Stefano, from which they being in this case Elena and Vivaldi, of course accompanied by Paolo, escape in Book 2. You remember that underground, kind of labyrinth they find themselves in, this like catacombs. They actually don't run into catacombs as much. I think there is some suggestion that in fact there are people buried down there. But you remember they wind all the way through these corridors, which are in fact below ground, underground passages, basements, or what have you, and end up stuck at that fence, right, at the gate that's locked, and they're helped by the monk. You remember all those episodes. We spend quite a bit of time in such moments. Of course, we have at Paluzzi as well, or in such locations. At the Paluzzi ruins as well, you will recall, Vivaldi and Schedoni, Vivaldi and Paolo are in a underground kind of crypt. Okay, so check. Well, what about shadows, a beam of moonlight in the blackness? Some episode in which you have folks immersed in darkness, and funny little strange lights flicker, a candle or what have you. And this is, Milani sees fit to include this. I believe it's a fairly idiosyncratic inclusion on this list, but nevertheless, yes, again, right? The shenanigans with the lantern at Paluzzi, of course, which is obviously a very Gothic scene. It keeps coming up as we discuss these various elements of Gothic. Or the darkness against which Schedoni contends. You remember the episode in which he's preparing, we just talked about, he's preparing to stab Elena, and there's lots of darkness with little spots of light going on in that scene as well. Okay, so another check, and then these extreme landscapes like rugged mountains, thick forests, or icy wastes. And yeah, there's lots of that. Almost every time they go outside and they move from one setting to another, one location to another in the book, we encounter another set of rugged mountains or thick forests, if not icy wastes. We're going to run into some icy wastes next week, as you will see. Well, omens and ancestral curses. Now, we may have a negative here. I don't think we really see here the way we do in Walpole, for example. I mean, that's really central to what's going on in Walpole. The ancestral curse is what opens the book. And of course, at the climax of the book, the climax of the plot, it comes true. The omen proves prescient, accurate. Okay. So I don't know that we have superstition in the book. And in fact, when we get to the next plate, maybe we're going to see a reason why, in fact, we don't have omens and ancestral curses in this book as much as we do, for example, in the Walpole book, or if you saw the Lewis book, you would see that there's this sort of thing is going on in that book as well. Magic, supernatural manifestations, of the suggestion of the supernatural. Well, we have the suggestion of the supernatural, the monk's visitations at the arch in book 1. But again, the next panel, I'm going to go ahead and give it a check, because we certainly have a lot of suggestions of such. But I mean, the whole point of the whole basis of the claim, which we're going to turn to next, that maybe really do it all, do all the math. And you see the anti-Gothic nature of the book. I think that is in so many ways related to how the supernatural is treated in the book, as we're going to see in the next panel. Okay, a passion-driven, willful villain, hero, or villain. Well, I'm not even going to address that one, right? You just say Schedoni, a curious heroine with a tendency to faint and need to be rescued. Yeah, we have some scenes like that. You know, it's interesting. It's kind of complex, this book. It's written by a woman. It's not Walpole. It's not Lewis. And it's interesting. If you look at some of the examples where you might expect to see Elena swooning, fainting, and whatnot, as the damsel in distress who needs to be rescued. Yeah, I mean, she does need to be rescued, doesn't she? I mean, they rescue her from the clutches of the abbess, which are really the extended claw hands of, right, the Marchesa, right, Vivaldi's mother. But you have these interesting moments that depart. Again, I don't see any of this as disqualifying the book. I think it's just a complicated feminine version of Gothic that we have here, where, interestingly, it's Vivaldi who swoons at the end of book 2, part 5. Now, of course, he's just been stabbed with a sword or something, but it's not, it's interesting. She stays conscious. She remains conscious and wailing and, you know, kind of melodramatic, you know, farewell, Vivaldi, farewell, forever, farewell. I mean, it's, he's pretty melodramatic as well, is Vivaldi. Okay, so we have some of the convention, some of the stereotype there. We do have it in evidence, but at the same time, I see a little bit of a challenge to it. She remains aware of what's happening the whole time that she is being abducted, you know, for the second time, second abduction. He saves her from the first abduction, then she is abducted from her, you know, from in the middle of this mission to save her. And that's when, of course, she's brought to the beachside manor or mansion, inhabited, it's owned by Schedoni, but inhabited by Spilotro. Okay, so a hero whose true identity is revealed by the end of the novel. You know, we saw this with Walpole's Theo, clearly. Here again, it's interesting. It's Elena, who I'm going to call this Radcliffe's womanist Gothic, sometimes called feminine Gothic. It's some critics have created this category of the Gothic called the feminine Gothic, and Radcliffe is at the heart of it. And it's interesting, in the feminine Gothic, or the womanist Gothic, the one who is revealed, or has to be revealed to be aristocratic, is not a Theo, a young man, okay, but indeed it's Elena, who turns out to have an aristocratic background. So it's an interesting little switch there that I think we can associate with the sort of proto-feminism that I know some of you have been interested in of Radcliffe. Okay, and then the final one in this list of Milani, or by Milani, horrifying or terrifying events are the threat of such happenings. And of course, there are any number of such examples in the book. I would call your attention specifically in this moment, since we are talking about the book, towards the end of the book, and what to make of the book as a whole. You've got the, quite possibly, the ending of the book on your minds in this moment. And you can, of course, turn to Niccola's death at the very end, when he is poisoned rather craftily by Schedoni, is certainly one of those horrifying or terrifying events. And not just the threat of such a happening, but it is the thing itself. And it prompts, of course, that little screech, which really freaks them out, you know, from Schedoni, that, you know, horrifies them. And again, some of you talked about this, and I think said some very nice things about it in the discussion. So, no doubt about it, there are a number of conventions, Gothic conventions, that the story, the novel, observes. But in at least one significant sense, it seems to me that the book is, and I've given you some indication of where I'm going with this, so I think you can anticipate it. There's at least one significant sense in which it's profoundly anti-Gothic, this book. And I think you can encounter this sense in little moments where these moments seem kind of unimportant, but they really are indicators of something, right? For example, in volume 3, chapter 7, when the Inquisitor demands of Ansaldo facts, said the Inquisitor, these are only surmises. And Ansaldo replies, facts will come soon. The mention of them will petrify you, Holy Fathers, as they did me, though not for the same reasons. And then later, so there's this kind of insistence on facts. And, you know, the Inquisition ends up doesn't smell as bad at the end of the story as it does at the beginning of the story, or at least at the beginning of its time, its presence in the story, right? When you consider that it seems to be interested in facts and it seems to obey or observe and take into account and even hearken to to fact. And as Paulo puts it, plain truth. You remember the moment in volume 3, chapter 8, when Paulo says, and he's copping an attitude often, isn't he, when he's talking about the Inquisition, which apparently was a pretty unhealthy thing to be doing during the actual time of the Inquisition. But here we have Radcliffe taking a little bit of license. Silence, said Vivaldi with emphasis. Paulo, I command you to be silent. They shall know a bit of my mind, continued Paulo without noticing Vivaldi. I'll tell them what they have to expect for all their cruel usage of my poor master. And he goes on to say a little bit further down the paragraph, they shall hear a little plain truth for once in their lives. However, they shall hear. And Vivaldi silences him again, as he does so often. But you have Paulo, again, touching on that note of truth and fact, plainness, as opposed to this intrigue that they seem so fascinated by, as we read in so many passages which describe for us the Inquisition's fascination with some kind of strange truth that can only be wrung out of the person before them by means of torture, can only be screwed out of them by way of thumb screws. And sometimes the truth, according to people like, it seems to me, Radcliffe, sometimes the truth is right there, as plain as the nose on your face, right? And doesn't need to be sought, and is not, this is actually said about Schedoni on a couple of occasions. He was so used to intrigue and so used to things, because of his own mind and his own way of proceeding. He was so used to the surface of things being a lie that he would encounter plain truth and would not see it as such, right? So I think that's a big part of what the book is about, is that there is a fact of the matter and there is a plain truth that can be discovered, right? And again, as I said about the Inquisition, I mean, the Inquisition by the end of the story seems at some level to kind of recognize this. I mean, the facts come out and the truth is something that is ultimately solicited and summoned, and they, hearken to it. So what we're talking about is, of course, something that's very much opposed to that supernaturalism that is in, as you see, as I'm right here on the panel, that Gothic supernaturalism that's indulged uncritically, indeed exuberantly, by Walpole and Lewis. And Radcliffe makes that purely illusory and suggests that there's this plain, unadorned, quite natural truth, right, that is there to be found. And she suggests that all seemingly supernatural events in the story, and there are lots of them, but they're all seemingly supernatural events, right? They all turn out to have a perfectly reasonable, a perfectly natural explanation. Nicola, for example, is brought on the scene and endowed with a backstory and a motive, jealousy and revenge. You remember this. This occurs in volume 3, chapter 7. Nicola, of course, being that monk that we meet early on, it is not Schedoni, it is this friend of his, Nicola, who is his agent, is acting on his behalf. And this Nicola di Zampari was ungrateful then. You had rendered him services, said the Inquisitor. All this comes out later, that there's this enmity, this hatred that Nicola's developed for Schedoni, and that's why he rats out Schedoni at the ending. Scudoni says, the cause of this enmity I can well explain. Explain, said the stranger. I call upon you in the name of your deceased brother, reveal the cause of my enmity. As it turns out, his accuser is in fact Nicola. And he goes on to say, Scudoni goes on to explain, I promised this accuser, this Nicola di Zampari, to assist his preferment, his advancement in the church with what little interest I possessed. It was but little. Some succeeding circumstances encouraged me to believe that I could more than fulfill my promise. His hopes were elevated, and in the fullness of expectation, he was disappointed. For I was myself deceived by the person in whom I had trusted. To the disappointment of a choleric man, I'm to attribute this unjust accusation. So here's the motive, and I think we're supposed to take Scudoni's sense of things in this moment seriously. It turns out that there's no strange, bizarre motive of Nicola's. He's just angry because he feels betrayed by Scudoni, and he feels that he did something for Scudoni and he got nothing in exchange. And a promise was broken and payment was not remitted. So we have revenge. I think there's also jealousy on the part of Nicola that's revealed in other moments. But these are pretty, nuts and bolts motives. There's nothing too supernatural or weird or strange or terrifying about these motives. They're pretty garden variety, right? That we see at the heart of at least the outcome of the story, because Nicola has a large part to do with what happens. And of course, it's a little bit that thing out of Hamlet, you're hoist on your own petard. Scudoni uses this guy and it gets used. Okay. She does more than that, though. It's not just this business with Nicola that Radcliffe, by means of which Radcliffe makes Gothic supernaturally, renders it purely illusory, but she even makes Gothic susceptibility, in the case of Vivaldi, a character flaw, okay? Vivaldi's credulity, his gullibility, his willingness to take supernatural events seriously as such, emerges as, his chief character flaws is revealed later by, of all people, Scudoni once again. And we see this from the very beginning of the story. We don't need Scudoni to tell us this, but when Scudoni does, and once again, there seems to be this kind of authority in what he's saying here at the end, even though he's a bad guy, he can tell the truth, right? But, just to give you a quickest little example here in Volume 3, Chapter 7, before we have Scudoni actually point this out very clearly to us, that Vivaldi has this susceptibility. We see the susceptibility in action for the umpteenth time here in Volume 3, Chapter 7, 347, in the Oxford World edition. Vivaldi says, I've heard of the spirit of the murdered. He's talking to himself. Restless for justice, becoming visible in our world. That's a very supernatural kind of thing. But Vivaldi checked the imperfect thought, and though his imagination, we read, inclined him to the marvelous, here as so often, and to admit ideas which, filling and expanding all the faculties of the soul, produce feelings that partake of the sublime. This is the bad sublime, not the good stuff out there in nature. He now resisted the propensity and dismissed as absurd a supposition, kind of a reading, a construction or interpretation, which had begun to thrill his every nerve with horror. He awaited, however, the result of the examination of what might be the further conduct of the stranger, with intense expectation. So he gets more empiricist and wants to pay attention to the facts on the ground, as opposed to rising up into the sky in one of these flights of terrified wonderment, which are so common with him. Okay, and I might as well cut to the chase and call your attention to that moment when Scudoni does lower the boom on him. It's in Volume 3, Chapter 11, page 397 in the Oxford World's Classics. When Vivaldi and Scudoni are having a conversation in front of the entire Inquisition, and Vivaldi says, Father, you have never loved, or you would have spared yourself the practice of art. Did you believe that an anonymous, they're discussing what happened. And Scudoni says, I thought I'd scare you off by means of the monk, right, Nicola. And Vivaldi says, it's ridiculous. Did you think that as he puts it, an anonymous advisor could have more influence with me than my affection, or that it could be terrified by such stratagems into a renunciation of its object. And something very interesting happens at this moment. Schedoni says, I believed that the disinterested advice of a stranger might have some weight with you, but I trusted more to the impression of awe, which the conduct and seeming foreknowledge of that stranger were adapted to inspire in a mind like yours. And I thus endeavored to avail myself of your prevailing weakness. And Vivaldi's a bit taken aback. He says, and what do you term my prevailing weakness? Schedoni answers, a susceptibility, which is the word I use up a bit above. I might as well mention credulity or gullibility. A susceptibility which renders you especially liable to superstition. And he goes on to explain that in a moment, he refers back to a moment in which he discovered this about Vivaldi. Vivaldi has offered some opinions that Schedoni has called some attention to. Vivaldi says, I do not recollect that I then disclosed any opinion that might justify your assertion, that he had this susceptibility. And Schedoni says, the opinions you avowed were rational, but the ardor of your imagination was apparent. And what ardent imagination ever was contented to trust to plain reasoning? There we have that business about the plain in the factual, or to the evidence of the senses. It may not willingly confine itself to the dull truths of this earth, but eager to expand its faculties, to fill its capacity, and to experience its own peculiar delights, soars after new wonders into a world of its own. And look at the response of Vivaldi. Vivaldi blushed at this reproof, now conscious of its justness, and was surprised that Schedoni should so well have understood the nature of his mind, while he himself, with whom conjecture had never assumed the stability of opinion on the subject to which the confessor alluded, had been ignorant even of its propensities. So, by the end of the book, as we see, Vivaldi has escaped some of these excesses of wandering imagination, right? Where the dull facts, as they appear to the imagination, they're dull. The dull, boringness of plain truth, as Paulo puts it, is just ignored, okay? And the supernatural is it takes its place and enchants and whatnot. And this is all shown as his mistake, and this is something that's manipulated, right? Schedoni manipulates and gains power over Vivaldi because he knows that Vivaldi has this tendency, and Vivaldi has to conquer, or certainly I don't think he ever really absolutely conquers it, and maybe that's a good thing at some level, but he has to temper it and he has to control it. He's got to corral it, imagination, which I think he does by the end of the book. Well, you see where this is going. If he's going to be successful, right? If he's going to save, Elena, if he's going to survive his time in the Inquisition, and if he's going to end up at the end of the book with even half of a brain left, he's going to have to do this. Well, you see where this is going. The premise here is that one can be anti-Gothic, as is Radcliffe, I'm arguing in the end, only by criticizing the Gothic, right? And in order to criticize the Gothic, why not take a Gothic personality, a character out of Walpole? I think Vivaldi is very close to Theo in certain ways, as I think we've already seen, even though there are important differences, but there's a continuity there, right? Why not take a Gothic personality, a character out of Walpole, for example, and have him learn to reject Gothic nonsense? And let's not get hung up on the Vivaldi equals, or maybe doesn't, Theo, okay, Theodore claim. Let's not get hung up on that. Let's just imagine that you just take a character who has witnessed what the characters in Walpole witness, which is a lot of authentically supernatural things, right? And you take that character who's maybe had that experience, who lives in that world, and you pull him out of Walpole and you put him in a realist novel, a world that's governed, it's like our world. It's governed by the world of many of us, most of us. It's a world governed by fact. It's a world in which, you infer truths from plain facts, and these natural, somewhat dull, as Schedoni puts it. That's in fact how the everyday facts are looked at by people who have this susceptibility, this power of imagination, right? You put them in that world where those facts they're facts, they're truth, right? There isn't any truth to supernatural phenomena. They're all revealed at the end to be manipulations, right? So you take a personality or a character out of, as it were, personality formed in a Walpole world or the world of Matthew Lewis, where crazy things happen, right? And you put him in this world of realism, and you have him learn to reject all that Gothic nonsense. So it's in that sense that the book is anti-Gothic, and I find that to be a really important sense, okay? Which makes me feel that the book, although it's taught in Gothic literature courses, it, in a sense, signals a turn against the Gothic in all its Gothicness, okay? Because most of the Gothicism, so to speak, indulged by the book, by Radcliffe in the book, is indulged with the purpose, ultimately, of explaining it away, okay? As, in fact, the figment of an imagination that has a susceptibility that it's going to have to learn, if it wants to be happy in the world, it's going to have to learn to temper. Okay, well, this has gone on long enough. This panel as well as this video. So let's turn to, well, you'll see in the next plate. So this coming week, let's not forget about the Gothic. Rather, let's ask, how does this book, Frankenstein, continue the Gothic tradition as we've seen it and begun to explore it in its 18th century original manifestation? I especially want to discuss how the book responds, how Frankenstein responds, if it does respond. That's the question. Does it respond to Walpole's Whiggish critique of absolutism, authoritarianism, and so forth? It was the topic of a video a few weeks ago. This is a question we could go back to with regards to the Italian as well. See you next time. Bye-bye.